Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. The show today, Roger Mills. So Roger is a therapist that I really trust, someone I've worked with myself, I've recommended to lots of people. He's got a background in different systems, but he's particularly a specialist in working with trauma and with the EMDR system, which I'm sure he'll explain. So Roger, welcome.
Thank you. Hi.
Where are you today?
I'm in my office in Eastbourne. I've got a couple of practices. One of them is in Eastbourne, where I spend sort of a day and a half a week, and the rest of the time I'm in an office in London, central London.
Yeah, Roger and I, we've just been talking about our different colds, and I'm just getting over something which may or may not be corona, and you've had a little bit of illness as well. So you seem to be on the right side of that now, though, right? I
think so, yeah, and mercifully not got many of the corona, the particularly nasty corona symptoms like shortness of breath and fever and that sort of stuff. So I think I'm sticking with the heavy cold thing.
Sticking with that here, otherwise, yeah. Why not? Probably statistically still very likely. And I normally ask people at the beginning, like, what's their journey with the body, because it's the Embodiment Podcast. Give us a sense of sort of like where you grew up and, you know, what was been your engagement with the body as you've grown up.
Okay, well, I mean, if I can answer that in terms of, and I hope I'm not dodging the question here, but in terms of how much my interest in the body from a therapeutic point of view has developed, I would say it has developed increasingly because my sort of therapeutic journey was, in a sense, a slightly complicated one, in that the first approach to therapy that I studied was existential psychotherapy, and I did a 2-year diploma in that. Then I moved on from that to psychodynamic counselling and psychotherapy, which is basically the approach that was pioneered by Freud and then Melanie Klein, and then been sort of massively developed subsequently. And that was my sort of main formation. But then when I'd finished training, I started working for a company that provided psychological services for businesses. And I got into actually running we had a trauma department because two of our biggest customers were Lloyd's TSB and Nationwide. And this was back at the start of the 2000s. And there were quite a lot of bank robberies going on at the time. And so I got involved in supporting staff who'd been through a bank robbery. Which was fascinating in many ways. But through that work, I started to get introduced, or I started to hear about EMDR, which was a relatively new approach to working with trauma, psychotherapeutic approach to working with trauma. And so I started to get very interested in that, went and got myself some training. And to come to your point, EMDR, one of the many things that it does is it actually places a great emphasis on the body and where emotions are held in the body. And so although I would say that my other therapy trainings had not involved the body a great deal, EMDR certainly did. And it's become, I would say, more and more important to me in my therapy work now. So a question that I will often ask somebody is, you know, where do you feel that in your body? If you're saying you feel, so somebody says something like, you know, yeah. If I feel I'm useless or I'm not good enough, which sadly is a very common thing to hear in a psychotherapy session. Yeah. I might say, locate that feeling in your body. Where do you feel that in your body?
Right. So to challenge a belief, or just to what would be the benefit of saying that?
Well, the benefit of that is that when you use EMDR, which we'll describe in a great deal more detail, I'm sure, you target not just the belief, but you target the physical manifestation. And by target, I mean, I'd say to somebody, right, think about that, notice what you're feeling in your body, and then we'll do a set of eye movements, which is the EM bit of EMDR. So the therapeutic approach involves focus on not just the cognitive manifestation of something, but also the physical manifestation of it. Also, of course, the emotional manifestation of it as well.
Great. So before we get into EMDR's approach, I think this is really interesting, your journey that you started off, with these quite cognitive approaches that were extremely cerebral, existential therapy and psychodynamic therapy. And then sort of when you were actually confronted with this very practical situation of traumatized bank tellers, the body came to the fore.
Yeah. And I think that, there's another aspect to the story that I'd like to add, which is that particularly psychodynamic therapy, which is, another way of describing psychoanalytical therapy. The two words mean more or less the same thing, or pretty close to the same thing. Within that approach to therapy, odd though it may seem, that the primary emphasis isn't actually on making people better. The primary emphasis is on making people understand themselves better. Right. And the idea is that if you understand yourself better, then you will get better. So Freud argued that the goal of psychoanalysis was making the unconscious conscious, and that if you can make unconscious drives and motivations and feelings conscious, then things then things improve. And whilst that may have been true for some of the issues that he was dealing, notably hysteria, which was the main issue that he was facing at the beginning of the 20th century, it I think is much less useful for the sorts of problems that people are predominantly facing now, which I think are largely anxiety, low self-esteem. If I look at the bread and butter of the sort of stuff that comes through my consulting room door, those are the sorts of issues that, above all, you face, as well as trauma as well, of course.
And maybe you could say, I find you very clear, Roger. I think you're very good at explaining things because you've spent a lot of time sort of on the front lines taking people through this who, don't have academic or psychological backgrounds. We've done a lot of episodes on trauma. There's in-depth ones, Steve Hodgkinson's and Paul Linden and Irene Lyons, and you had all sorts of people on. But just for those who are fairly new to it, could you give a brief definition of what trauma is and how it is?
Okay, well, I think that a good way of describing trauma is that basically it's a disorder to do with remembering. And what I mean by that is that when you've been traumatized by something, you remember it differently from how you remember a non-traumatic event. And if we start by trying to define what's a traumatic event, to my mind, is an event that is emotionally overwhelming in some way. Now, you could say, it's got to be life-threatening. Actually, I don't think that's right. There's some debate about whether something like bullying can be traumatic. Now, bullying's not necessarily going to feel like it's life-threatening, although it can do. But I think it's certainly often traumatic because it's emotionally overwhelming. So you start with an event, or it can be, of course, multiple events, which are emotionally overwhelming. And then you have to look at what happens in terms of how that event is remembered. So if you think about a non-traumatic event, so let's take me talking to you, which I'm hoping and assuming is not a traumatic experience for either of us. So your brain takes in a number of bits of information. So what you can see, what you can hear, smells, tastes, physical sensations, thoughts and feelings. All of that is what constitutes your experience of the present. Okay, but if we fast forward 24 hours from now, most of that will have gone and you will have held on to usually a few mental pictures and a kind of intellectual sense of what was discussed or what happened. And crucially, that event will have a sort of time code on it that says to you, that is finished and that's in the past and that's done.
Yeah.
So that's what happens with a normal memory. Unfortunately, when somebody's traumatized, they end up with a different kind of memory. What happens is that because the body goes into the fight or flight response, which I imagine I probably don't need to explain a great deal about to your listeners, flood of adrenaline into your system, heart rate goes up, rate of breathing goes up, muscles tense up, digestion shuts down. Those are the physical fight or flight reactions that most people know about. But there's one other reaction, which is incredibly important, which is that another stress hormone, adrenaline is a hormone, another of the stress hormones, something called cortisol, temporarily damages the bit of the brain that is used in making memory, so that you end up with a completely different kind of memory when you've been traumatized by something. Mm-hmm. The kinds of memories that you have are much more vivid. Sometimes they can also be a bit sort of disjointed and jumbled as well, but much more vivid, much more alive. And crucially, those memories don't get that time code that I was talking about, which tells you that the experience is over and finished and in the past. And the unfortunate consequence of that is that a trauma memory feels much more vivid, much more alive. And because it's much more vivid and much more alive, you think that it's going to happen again, or something similar is going to happen again. Yeah. And as well as that, anything that reminds you of it, anything that connects you to it, makes you feel those emotions, that lack of safety all over again. So, for example, if somebody's traumatized by a nasty car accident, let's say that a silver car shoots out of a turning in front of them and they broadside it. Okay, the person who experiences that might well find that they feel intense anxiety whenever they see a silver car, even if the car is parked at the side of the road, so in a completely innocent and harmless position. Yeah. So this is the core problem with trauma, that you have a different kind of memory. You have very vivid, alive memories, and that the experience feels like it's sort of somehow stuck in a perpetual present tense rather than in the past. So the way I often describe it to people, it's the difference between reliving something and remembering something.
So Roger, what I really like about this description is I think it's really accessible, that it isn't threatening to say, hey, this is an issue with memory. It doesn't seem like I'm damaged and broken forever. And you explain it so simply. And, so I remember you once giving an example to me of like, hey, can you remember Christmas? Sometimes a bad example because it can be traumatic, but, like, hey, oh yeah, there's a faded memory. And then comparing that to a very hot or live memory, and this idea of reliving and how that can lead to inappropriate responses. I think it's just very straightforward to explain it that way. And, almost anyone can get their head around that. It took you, 5 minutes to explain that? I can imagine a normal guy working in a bank or in the army or whatever could hear that and go, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's not so threatening when I hear it that way.
Yeah, I think that also, one of the things about trauma and post-traumatic reactions is that they often involve somebody feeling completely unlike themselves. You have loads of reactions which feel quite out of character. So, for example, common reactions, people have flashbacks. People find that they have kind of intense anxiety in situations which never used to cause them anxiety previously. They become avoidant of things. They become much more irritable and intolerant. They can find that their relationships start to suffer with friends and closer personal relationships. So you find all sorts of things happening which are very unlike you. And in fact, it's a very common thing in my experience when I work with somebody who's been traumatized to hear them say something like, I just want my old self back. That's a remark I've heard many times in the past. And so as well as helping people to understand why trauma has what trauma does in the moment the moments that you're getting traumatized, I think it's also helpful to have accessible explanations, because it helps you to understand that you're not going mad, that you haven't become a different person, that your reactions are normal reactions, and that there's something that we can do about it.
That's important, isn't it? It's a few bits there to understand what's happened, and that to understand there is something you can do about it.
Yeah.
Right, and rather than just understanding it sort of cognitively, there's actually something that positive that can be done.
Yes, yeah, and that's obviously where EMDR comes in, which is a fantastically powerful and helpful way of working. I mean, if I could just track back briefly to what I was saying about psychoanalytical therapy, I've always as a therapist, I've always been most interested in therapists that actually basically help people to get better. Right. People generally don't come to therapists because they want to understand themselves to an infinitely subtle degree. They generally come because they have a problem and they want that problem to be resolved or to improve. And what I love about EMDR is that it is a very powerful and effective form of therapy. And I increasingly, so I started my training in EMDR in the sort of 2004, and you do a 3-part training. I did the final part in 2007, but I've been sort of adding to my knowledge of EMDR ever since, because it's a field probably like yours that is constantly expanding. There's new techniques, there's new ideas, and that's another very exciting part of it, I think. And I started using it more and more and more because it's effective and you see changes in people, and that's really what I find most rewarding in doing this work.
You know, it's interesting, isn't it? That should be the sort of heart of anything, is what works. Like, I came to you recently, I had developed a bit of a fear of flying, and I trusted you as a psychologist. So I was like, okay, I'd done some of my techniques, which are helpful. You know, I'm able to employ embodiment techniques when I'm flying to take the edge off the fear. So it wasn't unmanageable, but it was still there. And I was kind of interested in it, and we were exploring it in different ways, and the connections with this and that, the psychological. But ultimately, I just wanted to be able to get on a plane without being anxious. You know, that was my primary concern there. And even as a psychologist, there was all, passing interest in kind of where did it come from and this kind of thing. But more importantly, it was just like, hey, I just want to be able to go about my life. I mean, I don't know. Are you okay with me saying a little bit about that bit of work that we did? Or? Yeah, I think so. I can always edit it out if not.
Okay. So I mean, you know, one of the things that we worked on there was an experience of a bungee jump, which was an experience for you of feeling totally out of control, and that you recognised that your fears about flying were to do with control, and that the bungee jump experience had been what we call in EMDR a feeder memory. So a crucial memory feeding into another situation where you felt out of control, which was being in a plane. And by doing some work on the bungee jump experience using EMDR, it very substantially helped to change the flying anxiety. And that's a sort of, that's not an untypical bit of work that in EMDR terms, that you look for the crucial, that you look for the original traumas, if you like, and then you and if you can process them, then the related anxieties will resolve.
What's interesting is the way you work. I really like it because it has this slight depth psychology approach to it. And also working with the body, noticing body sensations, and tracking the body to notice connections. And often we end up sort of chasing things across several, this association, that association, and then there's just a very practical sense of the EMDR. So we should probably come to kind of what EMDR sort of practically involves, so people can have a sense of it.
Okay, fine. So almost start with a semi-apology, because the person who developed EMDR, an American psychologist called Francine Shapiro, who sort of developed it in the late 1980s, no longer with us, sadly, but she called it EMDR, and it stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And as far as I'm concerned, the name is by far and away the worst thing about EMDR. And Francine Shapiro herself very much regrets having christened it in such a lengthy and complicated way. And she would call it reprocessing theory now, but I'm afraid we're stuck with the acronym now. So I think it's EMDR forevermore. So basically, when you are using EMDR, you start You start by doing a normal therapy assessment. So if I was seeing somebody, regardless of whether I was going to be working with them for EMDR, first of all, I would want to find out a lot about what it was that brought them to see me. What are the problems? Get a lot of detail on that problem. So in terms of, when does it happen? What is the problem? What are the cognitive aspects of the problem? What are the emotional, behavioural aspects of the problem? What's going on in the body, and so on. And then I'd also, as any therapist would, I'd take a detailed history. So you're looking for experiences right from the start of somebody's life, but through childhood and teens and adulthood and so on, which might be feeding into the problem in question. And when you're doing that as an EMDR therapist, you're looking for what we call targets. I mentioned feeder memories earlier on when talking about your bungee jump. And what we're looking for is the kind of originating traumatic experiences which have got stuck in somebody and which are feeding into the situation in the present. So, if I take a kind of a simple, perhaps even a simplistic example, suppose you've got somebody who had a highly critical parent who was always telling them that their school results weren't good enough. That person might find being criticised by their boss an intolerable experience, make them very angry or make them very anxious. And you can see that the reaction that they're experiencing in the present links back to the past. And so part of my assessment would be thinking, okay, we're going to need to work on the present, but we're also going to need to work on the experience with that critical parent who was always telling you that you weren't good enough. So you start with an assessment. The next thing that you move on to, and this is also crucial, is giving people resources. And resources, by resources, what I mean are ways in which you can control difficult emotions. So ways in which you can reduce the level of your anxiety, ways in which, for example, suppose somebody's coming to see with you because they have very low self-esteem and they have deeply rooted feelings about not being good enough. I would look for experiences in that person's life when they have felt good enough, when they've done something that they were proud of, and most people have got something like that.
Yeah.
It's highly unlikely that we've got no experiences like that. And then I would use EMDR to build up and reinforce the memories of feeling good enough before you actually tackle the originating experiences. Okay?
Got it.
So we start with a normal assessment. We move on to building up resources. Another very common resource, by the way, would be a calm or a safe place, a visualization or a calm or safe place, particularly where somebody had experienced a situation where they'd felt in a lot of danger, which might be a car accident or an assault in the street or something like that. So you work on resources, and then you start the what we call the processing work. And the processing, in a nutshell, what you do is you get your client to think about their traumatic experience, and you get them to think about it in different aspects. You get them to think about an image that represents the worst part of that experience. Mm-hmm. You get them to think about the negative cognition that best fits that experience. And that's often going to be a negative thought about yourself. Or it might be a thought about your safety or your competence or something like that. But you look for a negative cognition. You look for the emotions, and you also look for where you feel that experience physically. So we were talking about the embodied aspect of EMDR at the start today. So you're looking at those 4 dimensions: the image, the cognition, the emotions, and the embodied aspect of the experience. And having identified them, you ask the client to think about those. Mm-hmm. And then you start doing a series of eye movements, EMs. Now, probably needs a bit of explanation. What EMs are, eye movements? Basically, I would ask the client to, I'd sit slightly to one side and a couple of feet from the client. Not quite sure what you'd do in coronavirus days, but anyway.
Quick quick break to tell you about our program. So as well as the podcast, we have various kinds of online training. So we have the Embodied Yoga Principles online training, as well as in-person training. Embodied Yoga Principles for yogis who want to get yoga off the mat, specialize in the psychology of yoga, unique postures. It's a 5-day training. We have one in Brighton, one in Berlin, and one in Austin, Texas. So if you go to Embodied Yoga Principles, you can find them. Also the online version of the training for people who can't make those dates. Excellent courses, the Embodied Yoga Principles training for the yogis. For the coaches and facilitators, we have the Embodied Facilitator Course. This is our flagship course. We offer it in Moscow, also in the UK. A 9-month adventure, real deep dive into embodiment. It's the biggest embodiment program I do. It could be like movement people who want to work in business more. We have people like dancers and martial arts teachers come to learn more about working in mainstream settings, but also for coaches and trainers who want something really well structured, who want to work on themselves, who want to learn practical tools, learn how to work with the body in facilitation. If you can't make EFC, and it is a big ask, there's an online course we run called the Foundations of Embodiment Certification. So if you go to Embodied Facilitator, you'll find the in-person, and then -FEC, FEC, F for Freddy, EC for Charlie, FEC, you'll come out with the Foundations of Embodiment Certification, and also do one-day events all around the world. So I'm just about to do a tour to Slovenia, Berlin, Copenhagen, Brussels, Amsterdam, and Brighton. The Brighton one is £10, which is like $15. So if you're coming from abroad, that could make that affordable. The Brighton one's always like a really big fun one, so that's coming up. Again, go to the Embodied Facilitator course to see all of these events, and we have a little online evening as well. If people just want a taster, again, that's £10. That's a 3-hour thing coming up as well. Embodiedfacilitator.com, embodiedfacilitator.com, and you'll find all those events, or Embodied Yoga Principles for the yoga ones. Okay, so that's the stuff that I sell. Oh, and the book, the Embodiment book. If you want to get my book and learn about embodiment through reading, you can also get the Embodiment book available at Amazon and no good bookstores. So there we go. Excuse the interruption, and back to the episode.
Pre-coronavirus,
we'll come back to coronavirus in a bit. But, for now,
we were able to sit closer to clients. And I would, I passed my hand from one side to the other, left to right, and asked them, keeping their head still, to track my hand with their eyes. Okay, and I'd do a series of eye movements, probably 24 sets of eye movements. And at the end of that, I would ask the client to say whatever came up for them. And I would sort of coach them a little bit before starting the EMDR, and stress that whatever comes up really does mean whatever comes up. And so it might be a thought, a feeling, a mental picture. Your mind might dart off to some other memory or experience. It might be a physical sensation and emotion. It might be a blank. And I make a point of stressing to people that there isn't a right answer to this. One of the wonderful things about EMDR, one of the things I like about it, is that you really are encouraging somebody to just follow their own processes without in any way dictating to them what that process ought to be. So you ask them to go with whatever comes up, and then when they've identified that, I will say to them, right, now focus on that, and off we do and do another set of eye movements, and so on and so on. And what tends to happen when you do it like this is that it takes a person very deeply into the emotional core of the experience. And as they do that, they start to process it so that the type of memory begins to change. So if you remember what I was saying earlier on about how a trauma memory is different from a normal memory. In a nutshell, what EMDR is doing is helping somebody to convert a trauma type memory where you relive an experience into a normal type memory where you remember an experience. And remembering really means that the experience loses its emotional power, its emotional weight.
It takes the charge off. My experience of this is I'm talking about it with you, I'm visualizing it, I'm feeling my body, and then sort of I do these little lefty right eye movements, like no big deal, looking left and right, kind of kooky the first time I did it, but I thought, why not? Let's give it a go. This guy sounds sensible anyway. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh,
that's not a big deal anymore. What happened there? And you
Yeah.
might do one of your little SUDs things where you say, oh, does it feel like a 7 out of 10 anymore, Mark? And I say, no, it feels like a 3 out of 10. What the hell happened?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned SUDs. So, yeah, at the start of working with somebody, you would always ask them, as well as, I mentioned the different dimensions of the problem that you would go through in terms of what you can see and the negative cognition and so on. Another thing that you would always ask them is, when you think about this memory right now, how disturbing does it feel to you? And put it on a scale, 0 to 10. 10 out of 10 is as disturbing as it could be. 0, no disturbance at all. And so your opening score is your kind of benchmark. And what I'm looking for as the EMDR progresses is that score is going to be dropping down. Not absolutely invariably. I wish I could say absolutely invariably, but in the vast majority of cases, you see that score start to drop, and I'm looking usually to get the disturbance level down to 2, 1, or 0, somewhere like that.
Yeah. So there's subjective units of distress, those numbers. And it sounds silly giving a number to things, but I find it can just give people a sense that they've achieved something.
Absolutely right.
Even though that's subjective.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I've many times found clients find it, gives them a huge sense of relief to say, well, actually, when I said, you realise that, when we first started working on this, I had this morning. I was working with somebody who a couple of months ago was 8 out of 10 in terms of how distressing this was a motorcycle accident felt, and now it's a 2, and it's a sort of sign to yourself. Okay, actually, this isn't the same thing to me anymore.
Yeah, I've almost found it almost surreal where I've gone, God, just 10 minutes ago or 20 minutes ago, I was really stressed about that. And now it just feels like remembering what I had for lunch yesterday.
Yeah, not always quite that quick, unfortunately.
You know me, I'm fast. But it's an interesting thing. I love the practicality of it. And there's a strong evidence base for it in that, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, which is like the British governing body for the healthcare system, that if taxpayer money has to be spent on something, it has to be well spent. So there's this institute set up to make sure things have an evidence base. I think last I read, it was like one of just a few therapies recommended by the NICE guidelines, because there's decent evidence.
I think for trauma, for PTSD, there are only 2 types of therapy that are recommended. EMDR is one of them, and the other is trauma-focused CBT.
I'm surprised on CBT, to be honest. I'm surprised that gets as much efficacy. I'm surprised. I guess some things that just don't have studies like some of the other somatic approaches.
I think it's important there to remember that trauma-focused CBT adds in some elements which you wouldn't necessarily find in conventional CBT.
Okay.
And actually, I have to say that on a few occasions I've worked with people who initially found processing work just too difficult, too overwhelming, and I found that using some CBT approaches first with them, and by that what I really mean is getting people to first of all write a narrative of what happened to them, and then read through that narrative and read through that narrative repeatedly in order to. I guess you could. It really is effectively, it's a form of exposure therapy in order to take some of the intensity out of the emotion. And I've certainly found that quite helpful on a few occasions. So I wouldn't want to completely knock CBT, but I do personally think that EMDR, in my experience, and I mean, it's a prejudiced experience because I'm more of an EMDR person than a CBT person, but I think it deals with things more quickly. I would certainly say that.
Yeah, I mean, I find it hard to imagine anything quicker than EMDR, and often the experiences I've had.
There's one. Can I just make one point which I wanted to say earlier on, but I think might be important for people listening, and that's that when you hear a description of EMDR, it does sound a little bit like hypnotism, and some people might be thinking, "Oh, does this mean I'm going to somehow be out of control, or the control of my mind is taking place?" And all I can say is absolutely not the case. It's nothing to do with hypnotism, and you are in total control of what's happening to you. Although interestingly, when somebody has an EMDR session, I think you've experienced this yourself. Your brain is working incredibly hard, and people tend to feel pretty knackered at the end of a session, and they describe it as, often people say things like, it feels like I've just sat an exam or something.
I often, I come to see you in Eastbourne, which says something because it's quite a way away from Brighton, and I quite like the fact that I don't have any work immediately afterwards. I normally go for cheeseburgers and then get the train back, and I don't have any work for a couple of hours afterwards. Okay. By that point, I feel sort of recovered. I've chilled out on the train, and it's midday, so it's normally quiet on the train. It's a pleasant journey. And after a couple of hours, I can sometimes feel like emotions come up or be a bit wiped out. And but I found normally in a couple of hours I'm sort of back to normal again afterwards. But I definitely wouldn't recommend be client facing immediately afterwards or something.
No. I mean, people, as well as finding it draining, people can also be quite churned up by EMDR at times, because it does mean that you access the emotional core of experiences in quite a powerful way. So that's one of the reasons why we do the resources before embarking on EMDR, so that you've got strategies that you can use in order to sort of manage difficult emotions. And an important part of it is that you always, with an EMDR session, you always have a sort of 10-minute wind down at the end of the session before it's time to conclude the session, so that the person is not sort of in the thick of their trauma experience and emotions when the clock ticks round to time.
Right.
So very, we pay a lot of attention to managing difficult emotions in EMDR, because EMDR is partly because EMDR is a powerful therapy, and partly because people are generally dealing with pretty difficult emotional states and situations in EMDR.
Yeah, we call that the U-curve of embodied work, and just making sure people are sort of coming out the other side of it when there's a session, and people being considerate and skillful. I think even dancing or any kind of meditation, any kind of activity that involves altered states, that's just considerate to people. So I would regard that as a sort of ethical and professional thing for nearly all of us.
Yeah, and EMDR literature is very, very careful on that. There's and actually, also part of your assessment of somebody, you would be looking for, if there was any evidence, for example, of psychosis or drug use or anything like that, you'd be very wary about wanting to use a technique like EMDR.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've always been misinformed about, how does it work? Like, there's different theories on this. Why should moving my eyes left and right make a traumatic memory not traumatic?
Very good question. I don't think there is a very good answer to it, but I think there are some good guesses. The one that I find most convincing is to do with the two hemispheres of the brain. In very simple terms, one of the divisions of the brain is left and right hemisphere, and the left side is associated with our sort of realistic, analytical, logical side, and the right side is more associated with our emotional side. Now, when people have trauma, they're in the grip of trauma memories, trauma reactions. They're very much driven by right side, and I think that a sensible description, although I don't think there is anything like the neuroscientific evidence to support this idea yet, but I think it makes sense to me to think of it in terms of the realistic, rational left-hand brain modifying the impressions of the right-hand brain. I mean, just in if you think that in simple terms, people have irrational feelings about their current safety after a traumatic situation. And they are irrational because, unless they're still in an unsafe situation, the trauma situation is over and finished. And it's about sort of trauma memories being modified by other memories which tell you this is over, this is finished, this isn't happening anymore.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, is there anything else you want to say about EMDR? I want to kind of bring this up to speed with the sort of virus stuff soon. But what else do you think maybe something is misunderstood or think that you should just be good to have out there about EMDR?
Well, I don't know how widely known it is, to be honest. I mean, I think there are an awful lot of trainings around and an awful lot of people who are trained in it. Although I think that probably although there are many people who are trained in it, I doubt that there are that many people who use it a great deal. And I think that's because people tend to think that they can only use it with PTSD cases, although that's certainly not the case. You can use it with a much wider range of problems. And you don't necessarily get that many PTSD cases cropping up in the course of your work. So I think people stop using it because they don't get the opportunity to use it, or they feel that they don't have the opportunity to use it. And that means that although many people have an EMDR training, I would very much guess that many fewer people actually use it. I mean, in my personal kind of journey, I was lucky because I was working for the company that I described earlier on, and was involved in a lot of trauma work. I got a lot of practice in it, and then and then when I left that company in 2005, it was, I immediately went to work at one of the Priory hospitals which had a trauma unit. So I was using it again there. And then I also started doing work for companies that basically worked with solicitors who were dealing with personal injury cases. So I got to do a lot of trauma work, mostly with people who'd been through car accidents or motorcycle accidents, something like that. But that meant that I, right from the start, I had a lot of exposure, a lot of opportunity to use EMDR. So it became a very, very important part of my work. And I think that lots of people don't have that experience, which means that they tend to kind of, like any training that you haven't used, you get rusty quite quickly, and so you stop using something.
I would say there's a lot of people talking about trauma now that don't have the kind of clinical experience that you have with kind of common cases of car accidents and bank robberies and assaults. And, you go right across the spectrum, don't you? And, often trauma in America, the narrative is coming from sort of veterans and war, but you've also got this tremendous sort of civilian experience, haven't you? And I wonder if there's anything that you hear about in the sort of American trauma literature which doesn't quite match your actual real world experience. Or misunderstandings that are out there would be another way of saying it.
I mean, I don't think I can really answer that because I'm not I'm not at all well read in terms of current work with veterans and so on. I mean, I have the impression that what's available to veterans in this country, in the UK, tends to be rather short term.
Yeah.
And I think that, with intensive trauma, you need a longer term rather than a shorter term therapeutic process. So, but that's just an impression. I don't know. I mean, I know there's a charity called Combat Stress, which I think works with British veterans. But yeah, I mean, I think that it is extremely important. It's not really an answer to your question, but it's extremely important that people are well trained and that they have the opportunity to build up a lot of experience. And then actually one of the interesting things about trauma is that although the traumatic event to which you are, or event or events to which you are exposed will probably vary a great deal, the types of reaction that people will have basically are the same cluster of reactions. So the reliving reactions where you have flashbacks or nightmares or intrusive thoughts about something, or trigger reactions where something reminds you of it. The avoidance reactions, and then the hyperarousal reactions like anger and sleep disturbance and so on. So the kind of the cluster of reactions is familiar regardless of the nature of the trauma that somebody's exposed to.
It seems to be pretty biologically wired. I've, as you know, worked cross-culturally quite a lot with trauma, and there's not that much difference between an Israeli soldier, an Afghan civilian, and an Ethiopian kid. When there's trauma, it's sort of the same stuff everywhere, just in different colours. It's basically the same stuff.
Yeah. I mean, in that respect, it's not different from, hunger reactions or sex reactions or something like that.
Right. Yeah, it's biological.
Yeah.
And maybe let's bring this up to speed then. So as we move towards close, that we're in this strange situation now. There's a lot of anxiety floating about. Some of it justified, some of it maybe not.
Yeah.
There's a certain, depending on where people are listening to this, I know we have listeners in China and Italy and places that are really severely affected, and places, by the time this comes out, who knows, Britain might be in a very similar boat. The US too. I know Germany's already heading that way. Spain's on lockdown as from today. I wonder sort of how this current situation might impact people with trauma. Any thoughts on the kind of crossover of these things?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, it can obviously lead to trauma reactions in some people. And secondly, it can make people who already have trauma reactions feel a lot less safe.
Oh.
So, corona is a virus that kills, and we are facing a situation which is of a gravity that I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that not since a world war have we been in this kind of situation.
Yeah.
And whilst you can say, okay, the at-risk groups seem to be quite a sort of, relatively speaking, a small and specific group. So, people with underlying health conditions and people who are, 65 and above, or that sort of thing. I say that because I'm 62, so I'm hoping I'm not in the at-risk group. But whilst you can say that many people probably don't feel at risk, there will be plenty of people who already have underlying anxiety issues who will be feeling much more at risk, perhaps irrationally, but they will be feeling that. And of course there'll be many people who sorry,
just to jump in, I was feeling that when I was sitting in my house, isolated, away from support, because I've been told to isolate. The shortness of breath was getting quite bad, and I was thinking, this is scary, even for someone that's pretty good at regulating fear and has been through some stuff. It was a pretty scary experience, and the mind plays tricks there. Like, well, maybe this is more life-threatening than it could be. What do I do if I can't, pick up the phone because I can't breathe? Like, there's real fear there, and fear of spreading it to other people, and social shame of how I'd be perceived if I did infect anyone else. There was a lot that came with that.
Yeah, and of course, it's not just about you. It's also about the people that you love and care about. So, many people will have elderly parents. I've got 2 elderly parents, both of them in a nursing home, and I'm concerned, obviously, as many people will be, about what happens if the virus gets into that environment where you've got a lot of vulnerable people. So you'll get people concerned about themselves. You'll get people concerned about their loved ones. You will have people exposed to, you could say, mini traumas. So if you're traveling on an underground train or a bus and somebody has a coughing fit right in front of you and you get sprayed with stuff, that might well end up being a traumatic experience for somebody. So I think that it's going to have. I think there will be people who get traumatized by corona. I think, as I said, people who suffer already with anxiety issues are likely to feel that much less safe, that much less stable because of the environment. There's another factor that's incredibly important as well, which we shouldn't forget, which is that corona is meaning that people have to isolate themselves. And if we all end up going the way of Italy, we're going to be very cut off from one another, and for people for whom social contact is vital, and people who suffer from loneliness and so on, this is going to be a very major thing, I think. So if you live in a family, maybe it won't hit you quite so bad. So it depends how you get on with your family, of course. But if you're living on your own and you suddenly find yourself having to live a totally isolated life, I think the psychological consequences of that could be pretty grave as well.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting that social support is a resilience factor to trauma, right?
Absolutely right. Yeah.
So it's like there's a few things that could interact in a way there. Ill health, social isolation. I definitely found it harder to be on my own with the symptoms than I would have been had I had something non-infectious and my wife was there. Yeah. That was definitely a trickier experience when I couldn't get a hug or, reach out to anyone. So, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. The other thing I noticed that we'll be having a number of conversations on this podcast, hosts about this very topic with different teachers of trauma and different backgrounds. But one thing I noticed actually as well was that it was also kind of exciting, like in the same way as it can make people feel quite alive, and this is another issue around trauma sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. And we're in uncharted territory and so you break out of the humdrum. I mean, whatever it isn't boring. And for some people that will be quite stimulating, and some people, I mean, I'm sure this very well, and probably have encountered people. Some people actually are stimulated by threat situations. You get people, I've known people who, they went into, say, relief worker work, out in dangerous parts of the world, because they love the buzz of it.
Yeah, I've been through that, and it is potentially an adrenaline rush, like a physical drug addiction almost. It's very similar, having had both. And I can definitely see why these things can be a buzz. I think it's one thing you have to really watch out for. Yeah, if you are a little bit wired that way, and if you've had a taste of that, it's one to watch for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Roger, we need to wrap up. So 2 things to finish. Where can people find out about you and your work or get some EMDR from you?
Okay. My website is all one very long word, Roger Mills London Counselling.
Thank you very much. We'll put that on the show links as ever. And closing message about the body or about trauma to finish.
It's something that's very treatable. And I think that one of the things that people find really difficult about trauma is that once you've got stuck in trauma reactions, it feels like you've changed forever, but you absolutely haven't. And I would argue that trauma is a more treatable condition than, say, chronic depression.
Well, yeah, a message of hope. I love that. Great place to finish. Roger, thank you very much for joining us today.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/Embodiment Podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodiedfacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. Most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodiedfacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment Podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodiedfacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator Course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you. Until next time, welcome home to the body.